So just take a minute to acknowledge that we've been in a world, probably most of us, probably most of the day, where our attention is directed outwards. Excuse me. That our focus is on the external world, which just by nature is a more gross, less defined way of perception and experience. And so I find it helpful sometimes just to acknowledge that we're moving inward into a softer, um, gentler, potentially more vivid and experiential dimension of awareness. And notice if you're bringing any of the outer world, the energy, moods, emotions that you've been carrying with you during the day, if just unwittingly you're bringing them into the meditation with you. And you can experience that by looking at the activity in your mind, how your body feels, and the quality of your attention. And so, to the degree that any of that's happening, and even if things are pretty good on that score, just begin to allow both the mind and the body to slowly release, let go, dissolve any tension, holding, any moods. And if there's thinking, just allow the thinking to move into the background and allow your experience of the body and of the energetic expression and sensations of the breath in the body, move that into the foreground. Don't worry about trying to stop or lessen thoughts if we just allow that to move into the background and bring our physical awareness and the awareness of sensation in the body into the foreground. The thinking will either disappear or just no longer be interfering. And then you might also take a moment to intentionally set a willingness to open your heart and your mind to whatever experiences are waiting for us in this next period of time. We have to be willing and, in some sense, wanting as an affirmative aspiration to open and receive the experiences that are about to appear. It presents a little uncertainty, the need for some degree of vulnerability. It's a very small level of risk compared to it allowing things to open and to begin to evolve and become more spacious as we move into the meditation. You might take a moment at this stage in the meditation to check in and evaluate the level and quality of energy that is present in the body and the mind. If our energy drops below a certain level, first the awareness starts to become scattered and unfocused, and then it weakens. And then if the energy continues to dwindle, we begin to go into semi-sleep states that actually can be quite pleasurable if they're not meditating. So it's worth the effort 2 or 3 times during a sitting if you see that your energy isn't stable to check in with the energy and see whether or not you need to bring it up. And do that with deepening your breath, with opening your eyes and getting some light in, shifting the focus of your attention to sound if there's sound in the building, or to sensation in the body by touching the arms and the hands and the legs and the knees, actually waking the awareness up intentionally. If you're really sleepy and you want to meditate, the most effective thing is to stand up and to meditate standing up, which is really helpful. And it's pleasant, it's enjoyable. Um, you can start focusing on your feet and the balance in your legs and your hips, the alignment of your spine. There's so much that you can do with the meditation while you're standing up. But in any event, it all comes back to energy. So in the last few minutes of this sitting, I always find it helpful to begin to step back a little bit. Our awareness has usually been uh, up close to the experience that we're having. And just beginning to pull back a little bit and without opening your eyes, feeling the contours of the body, the weight of the body. There's sound in the room. And then just noticing the quality of awareness that is present, whether or not you are able to maintain a quality of awareness or that the awareness got uh, moved down into a lower, duller level. But once again, without opening the eyes, just allow the awareness to move into the fingers and the feeling of whatever they are touching, whether that's um, the skin of your hands or the cloth on your pants or your dress. And notice the temperature in your body, the temperature in your forehead is different than your arms, your feet, your armpits, and your mouth. And notice if your body's awake or a little sleepy. There, Bailey's trying to help the body wake up. And then just allow the eyes to begin to slowly wake up and notice the shapes and forms in the room, angles, shadows, quality of light, color, and then just allow the awareness to expand out into the whole room, the body placed in the room, and then just coming back into the present moment. So thank you. Okay, so I just wanted to mention that we'll take a quick break, just maybe 5 minutes. But the topic when we come back, I think is interesting, and the way it's framed is interesting because we don't hear it framed from this particular way that much. And so it's about wisdom, but it's the experience of insight and experiencing either through the sense of self, through the ego, or the experience of insight through the emptiness of self, when the self or the ego and its management and control is not present. And so these are two significantly different phenomena and different aspects of practice. So that's what we'll dig in on when we get back. It's 6:35. Okay, so I think I'll jump in here. Okay, so good evening again, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. Um, the topic of tonight's talk and hopefully a discussion is wisdom and the particular form of wisdom, insight, and experiencing through the self or the ego and experiencing through the emptiness of self or ego. So I think that this is a helpful and important topic. I hope it's helpful for you. It's something that has been really valuable for me. So insight in the Theravada and Vipassana tradition is the defining element of this particular school of Buddhist practice. Vipassana is the term Vipassana, and Vipassana meditation is loosely translated as insight meditation. So, for example, our group in Sacramento is called Sacramento Insight Meditation because the experience of insight is the defining piece. It's the endpoint of being present, of fully experiencing, of exploring, and then having a discovery and a recognition. And so it's classically defined as a spontaneous pre-verbal. It's not thought. It's a pre-verbal recognition that changes our understanding of ourselves and the world around us, or leads to our changing our understanding of ourselves and the world around us. And you'll see, a lot of little cartoons where a little thought bubble appears above somebody's house and head, and a light bulb goes on. Well, I think that's a good image here, but it's not conceptual, it's not intellectual, it's experiential. And classically, in Buddhist practice, it focuses on some element or combined elements of the three characteristics of existence. So the first being constant change, or anatta, identity, the constant change, anicca, identity, anatta, and then suffering, or the other side of suffering, which is freedom, satisfaction, and peace, peace being the highest form of happiness in Buddhist practice. So I think this is a valuable topic because it helps us clarify what we're doing in practice and why we're doing it. It's kind of a good reality check. So where I like to start with this discussion is historical conduct, and the thing that sent the historical Buddha on his initial search was the experience of seeing old age, sickness, and death embodied in three different human beings, and then a fourth person, a Medicate, a monk, who was equanimous in the face of these three life realities. So the Buddha went on an intensive search, which basically was designed to distance the mind from the physical reality of the body and old age, sickness, and death. So the first practices that he did was with a movement in India at the time called Shramana. These were homeless practitioners that would group together in small groups and practice together, and they did primarily austerity practices where there was a denial of food and water to the body, and focus on altered states of consciousness, basically. And you may be familiar with some of the statutes or some of the paintings of the historical Buddha during this period, where he's so thin you can see all of his ribs and his spine. And then as part of that, the focus of practice itself was on deep states of concentration, which are fundamentally altered states of consciousness that can be extraordinary. They can be formless. They can be the source of great bliss. But he found that when he came back from these altered states of consciousness, that although his mind had become quite refined, what had not happened is that his mind remained equanimous in the face of the real world. So he realized that either trying to deny the body or to remain in altered states of consciousness were not the answer to this dilemma. And he had his night of awakening, and he realized that the real issue that he was dealing with and that we're dealing with is not the physical reality of our body or trying to get into some altered state of consciousness or altered state of comfort, but our relationship with experience itself, our relationship with experience itself. So his focus was on the origin or birth, the life and the death of experience, not on the origin, birth, life, and death of the body. And the reason for this is that he was looking for a lasting form of peace that, and this is the key part, was not dependent on exterior or external circumstances, which includes the body. So he eventually embarked on a set of teachings which are not about physical death, but death of the experience of suffering, and specifically the death of the experience of being separated from an independent as an independent self, which as a source of suffering. And so there are many suttas where monks or nuns are quite sick or dying and are completely equanimous, that the focus clearly is not on the exterior circumstances that they're in or the condition of their body. It's their relationship with the experience of that and finding satisfaction and peace and holding that in a way that's uplifting. So there's an oft-quoted line in the suttas, and it's the most frequently repeated in the Satipatthana Sutra, the Four Foundations of Mindfulness, but all over the numerous teachings of the Buddha. And it says, experience arises and is understood. Experience is present and is understood. Experience passes away and is understood. So then what's repeated is all of the different factors that we know. Emotion arises and is understood. Emotion is present and understood. Emotion passes away and is understood. So it's birth, life, death, beginning, middle, and end. And if we could actually pay attention in this way, which is the most often recommended practice, seeing the arising, the presence, and the ending of quality states of mind, feelings, dependent origination. If we could actually do that, we would actually understand how desire arises and passes away, how attachment arises, and we get stuck on that, and how it can pass away, and how attachment moves into the sense of self as a fixed view and causes us to suffer, and how that goes away. So in terms of understanding, insight is fundamental understanding about the nature of change, about the nature of identity, and the nature of suffering, and then how that can lead to peace and satisfaction. So I want to talk about the two basic forms of insight. Their expressions have many, many different expressions, but the forms themselves, and the first one, which I think we're probably all familiar with, is insight or experiential understanding through the ego or through the self. And I want to use an illustration here that I'm hoping is going to be helpful. And this is a long time ago, so this is maybe in the mid-late 70s. And I have been practicing for a while, and looking back on it now, I realize I had no idea in the world, no idea in the world what I was doing. There was no internet. There were no good books out at this point to study. The availability of teachers was extremely limited. And so I had an intellectual understanding of a number of the fundamental teachings. So, I understood that intellectually that we create the world with our thoughts, and that our thoughts, particularly if they're fixed, could be so powerful that they would overlay on experience so that the mind would see the thought rather than the experience itself. It would misinterpret the physical sensation because the thoughts were so strong, and that um, the um, the mind, or through habit or through prior experience, would mistake unpleasant experiences for pleasant. It would mistake things that are not helpful for us as helpful. Um, so I understood that basic format, and I understood the basic principle of the connection of body and mind. So during this time period, I got really, really sick um, through combinations of a whole series of things, lifestyle, some events that happened in my life. And this was the time period when wellness was just coming into public view and medical view as something of value. So I went through a program over in Marin County that was eight months long, 2 or 3 days a week for 8 months. It was really extraordinary. This wide-ranging program that involved group therapy, individual therapy, nutrition, exercise, biofeedback, a whole series of things. So this is about the biofeedback experience. So this idyllic, perfect location over in Marin County in the middle of a forest. So you go in a big room, they put you in a recliner, and this was the old school biofeedback, which was all galvanic skin response. So they would hook up your hands and your chest and what have you. There were no images on computers or anything like that, like there are today. So um, they started by saying, well, just do what you normally do when you begin meditating. I mean, when you begin meditating, don't you normally kind of relax yourself and put yourself in a calm state of mood? Yes. So I'm doing that, and I'm thinking that I'm getting, very relaxed and concentrated. And then they turn on this little speaker, and the biofeedback machine was set up that when your skin stress and temperature was relaxing, so it was expanding, the little blipping sound would slow down. And that when you were tensing your muscles, and as a result, the blood flow was reduced. So like your feet would get cold, then the blipping would go up, and that would indicate you're not relaxing. So they turn this on, and it's kind of in a mid-range of boom, bip, bip, bip. And then they said, okay, well, we want you to relax now. So, of course, this is about effort. I start trying to relax. And as I start to try to relax, the little bipping sound on the machine starts going faster. So it goes from bip, bip to bip, 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 bip. And to make a long story short, in short order, the sound coming out of the speaker sounded like a hummingbird. It's just crazy. It was going so fast. And so it's like shocking. And so when we're talking about direct free verbal experience, I always use this as an illustration because at that moment, I understood a whole series of things experientially without any thought. I completely understood the relationship between body and mind. I understood that what I had thought I was doing to relax myself was actually making myself tense, and that I didn't know how to relax. That was part of the reason that I had gotten sick. And so this was just like shocking for me, and exciting, and dramatic. It's a fundamental, experiential, direct insight. And the first thing it did was set me off on questioning, like, if my mind could be so wrong about something so fundamental that something I was feeling was relaxation when actually it wasn't. What else could my mind be misinterpreting? And so that really set me off on a whole new search uh, of opening up the idea that I really didn't understand fundamentally the body mind connection in my own mind, and how my mind might be causing my suffering. And the second thing it did was, even though at this point my understanding of the teachings obviously were intellectual and very simplistic, it it just immediately established the validity of these core teachings. It's like it was just undeniable that these fundamental teachings were true in my own body and mind. So that was exciting. And this is one of the characteristics of real insight, is that when it happens, it's pre-verbal and you know it to be true. Um, Cognitive insight, which we all have, you believe it to be true, but until you test it out and experience it, you're not sure. You believe it, but you're not sure. This kind of insight, you know it when it happens. Now, the thing to note about this experience is that, as I'm hoping that you can hear, as potentially as exciting and as helpful this experience was, this was all through I, me, mine. It's all through the self, all through the ego. It was all about me. It's my story. Um, and this will help you manage and control things, but it's not going to uproot um, the basic causes of suffering, because you're not seeing the universal experience that's there. Um, if you follow it, it will take you to that place. But I think you can hear from the experience that I was describing, I wasn't experiencing a universal experience, although it may happen in everyone. I was experiencing it as my experience in my body and my life. So this is an illustration of insight, powerful insight, but insight through the self or ego. Okay. So the second kind of insight that I'd like to talk about is insight, experiential understanding without the self or the ego, through the emptiness of the self or the ego. And this is a little more difficult to talk about because our language is binary and dualistic. It's all either or. And this is not that kind of experience. So we're just limited. So I'll do the best I can here. So the experience of insight without the ego present, uh, and emptiness, being empty of the management and control and interference and judgment and presence of the ego, is experienced most commonly as just a dropping away or a release or a dissolving of a deep attachment to seeing through a sense of self. So the sense of separation that the ego and the self sets up, which immediately creates a conflict and where judgment comes from, just disappears. And what's present is simply a flow of energy and the collaboration of expressions of energy arising, passing away, uh, experiences being born, being present, and dying. And all of you're released, the experience is released from all the limitations and restrictions of craving, attachment, struggle, because the self is not there trying to control and interpret everything. All of the things that arise because of the self, desire, aversion, attachment, uh, are not arising. So I think the important part about this, because you'll hear people write about this, and they're trying to describe it, and frequently it's in kind of poetic and mystical language. The experience of itself is not as if there's fireworks going off or explosions, but it's just simply opening to experience that is unfolding. Arising, birth, being present, passing away, over and over again in a multitude of different ways. And it is experience of a completely different territory than we're used to, because we're so conditioned to be experiencing it through the self. And it is an experience of possibility, and it's an experience of ease, because the tension associated with the ego and the self is not present. So there's an energetic unity that's unfolding one moment at a time. Now, it sounds like this is something that is very unusual. And actually, Buddhadasa, who was a wonderful Thai teacher, one of the wonderful Thai teacher, and interestingly, for many, many years, he was a very successful businessman and didn't start teaching until later in his life. And so you're probably familiar with him and all of his books. Buddhadasa was a great advocate of the idea that we have moments of emptiness of self like this, off and on, semi-regularly. And because they aren't, because we're looking for explosions and fireworks and some dramatic thing, the fact that we're actually in a place where our mind is at ease and isn't judging and struggling, that we go right by the experience. And this was, Thich Nhat Hanh used to say that you have to be awake and ready and watching for this to happen, or it will go right by you. So Buddhadasa was a big advocate of practicing in a way that you were actually watching for these moments where initially it appeared like nothing was happening, and opening to them in a deep way and experiencing what was there. So these experiences can be large or small, but both through the ego and through the emptiness of the ego or the self, they result in a fundamental change of understanding of reality. They're not about ourself or our personal story, the emptiness experience, other than recognizing that it's just a story. So I want to give you just a really quick little illustration. It's a big experience and not enough time to really do it justice, but I just want to give you one illustration, because I think you may have had experiences like this as well. So one of the things that I've done, actually following John's model, was I've led several pilgrimages in India and Nepal and Thailand, and those have included being at Varanasi at the Burning Ghats. And the photos that you see of India where people are in the Ganges River praying are usually in Varanasi, which is considered the most holy city in the world for a Hindu. And when you go there, right above, there's the water in the Ghats, and then right above the Ghats, there are all of these little buildings. Some of them are restaurants, but a lot of them just look like these little ramshacked buildings, and you're not quite sure what they are. And what they are basically are little hospices, because the belief, the Hindu belief is that if you can get to the main burning ghat, there in the river in Varanasi, and be cremated within 24 hours of your death, you are guaranteed a positive rebirth. So these little buildings are filled with people who are waiting to die, and then they're brought down, they're wrapped according to their status in society, and then there's a whole procedure that goes forth. So the several times that I'd been there, we would put everybody to bed, and then I would go down to the main burning gap by myself, 10 o'clock at night, and I had made friends with the gentleman who was kind of the major domo of the site. And interestingly, all of the people who run these sites are deletes. They're the untouchables, because untouchables historically are the ones that deal with dead bodies and tasks and duties that nobody else wants to deal with. So when I would go down there at night, it was very dark, basically except for all the fires. And there would usually be a group of men on the outer rim by the water, and you had to kind of get through them to get up to where the bodies were burning. And there's very few people who look like me who are walking over there and trying to get in at 10 o'clock at night. So I would ask for this gentleman, they would get him, he would come down and take me up, and then he'd put me in this little area right at the back so I could watch everything. So one evening while I was there, a family was there, and her mother was being cremated. And the practice is for the oldest male to have their head shaved and be in a loincloth, and then they're kind of the officiant of the burning. And this young man saw me and came over, and he could speak broken English, and he asked me why I was there. And I told him that I felt that something sacred and beautiful was going on that I didn't fully understand, and that I was on pilgrimage, and I was there because I wanted to sit with the experience and understand it. So I think he must have liked that answer, because we talked a little bit, and then he asked me to join his family watching the mother, grandmother burn. And so I went over and sat down with the family, probably 15 of us, and then the bodies maybe 15 feet from us. And so at that point, there was probably another hour before body was incinerated, and then the final act is the skull is the thickest, deepest, hardest thing to burn. So the oldest boy takes a stick and hits the skull and cracks it open. And then this is, I think from a Western perspective, we would think maybe a little horrific, and from their perspective, it's a joyous moment, because everyone feels that at that moment the spirit is released and is free. And it's fascinating. The whole group is just, you can just see the whole tone change. There's this sense of relief that goes through everyone, and then they go home and have chai and talk about their loved one. So during the course of this, I had lots of different experiences. I had been down there many times before already, so I was familiar with the scene. But I'd never been this close, and I'd never been with the family. And at some point in this experience that I'm describing of a sense of separation, of a separate self trying to be there, understand this, relate to these, just completely dropped away. There's a sense of release, a sense of dissolving, and then just falling into this completely open place that you've never really been in before, and just with experience unfolding. So I have no idea how long that was. Retrospectively, it doesn't feel like some of these other insight anatta experiences. There's seconds. I mean, this felt like a while, but I don't know what that means. But I can tell you that the idea that an experience like this changes your fundamental understanding of reality and yourself, that is in fact what happens. And I'm a person who has had lots of death in their family. There were 12 children in my mother's family, big old Italian family, and we went through a 10-year period where all of them, except my mother and my aunt, died of cancer and other diseases, and I've had lots of friends go through things. Since this has happened, my experience of others dealing with the experience of dying and my trying to help them has completely changed. Uh, uh, yeah, I would say almost radically changed. So these two different forms of insight are waiting for us. They're the product of gradual, persistent, repetitive practice. It's not enough just to be mindful. We have to explore and investigate and discover. That's what insight is. Study, reflection, discussion is a big part of it. And I want to stress that the idea that this only happens like when we're on a residential retreat or in some deep dharmic moment is not accurate. It has to do with our consistently practicing, our consistently being mindful and investigating our lives. Joseph Goldstein has a quotation that I'll close with, and Joseph says, there is a mistaken belief in Dharma circles that the deepest insights come only during intensive retreats. That's not true. Notice what happens in any simple daily activity. So there's a whole world available to us with this decisive element of practice that's referred to as insight, this pre-verbal experiential process. And it's really worth exploring, understanding how you create the conditions for it to arise in your practice, and then to do that. So, okay, so I think we've got a little bit of time for discussions. If there's questions, comments, or thoughts, something that you might like to share.
Thank you, Dennis. For those of you in the hall, this is Robin Hennon. And if you're on Zoom and you have a question or comment, you can raise your hand or put up the little Zoom hand. And if you're in the hall, then Jen will come around and ask you or give you the microphone. Well, Dennis, while we're waiting for everyone else to maybe come up with a question or think profoundly about your talk, I would like to share. I really appreciate, what you're saying and these little experiences. I find that most of my insights are a long time after the teachings or the meditation and stuff, and in my daily life, and observing, oh, here I am reacting to this thing, or and what am I really reacting to? What is the motivation, and do I need to react that way? And sometimes all I can do is observe it and still react, and then hopefully stop myself before that. But it's so nice to have that reminder that these insights are really in our practice through, not just on retreat, but every day.
Yeah, I think that's one of the big takeaways here, Joseph's comment, because with like dependent origination, for example, once you begin to understand how craving leads to attachment, and attachment inevitably results in identity, then you can, if you start watching for it, you just see it all day long. it kind of becomes shocking that you didn't see it before, you know. Um, but we've got to make that conversion. I think it's the most difficult part for all of us in practice is like we hear a teaching and it makes so much sense, but like, okay, now how do I actually find that in my life? And I think what Joseph was saying and what I'm encouraging people to do is, well, where you find it is in everyday life, not thinking that it's in some profound experience in the future someplace. It's like, no, it's like actually now, you know. So
Yeah, and I think what the like the biggest take home for me is this reminder that not everyone has access to be able to sit on retreat,
oh,
for funds and everything, and so it's easy to feel left out or like it's not available to us if we can't afford to go and spend that time in it. But it's really in the daily process, and that we all have access and opportunity to experience insight, and we don't have to, it doesn't cost anything.
yeah. And there's the historical precedent for that, and for some reason I'm blocking on his name right now. Somebody will maybe will remember this as I start to talk about it. But the man who um, donated the land to the Sangha, which is now at Srivaste, Jeddah's Grove. And if you go there today, you can, we know that the Buddha and this extraordinary group of people that was with him spent at least 22 rain seasons there. And they actually built little compounds. There was like a little, almost like a little dispensary, pharmacy, hospital thing that they created, and that there were little meditation, sleeping cells, and what have you. So you can actually see that today. And as I say, for some reason I'm blocking on his name, but he was very, very wealthy, and he devoted most of his wealth to the Buddha and the Sangha, and he was never in a position to like ordain and become a monk and be in seclusion. And the Buddha recognized him as being fully awake, and it was all through his practice in daily life, you know. So in the West, I think and I understand why, but I think we've overemphasized the importance of meditation. It is, of course, essential, but there's this feeling that like if you're not going on retreat or if you're not spending long periods of time meditating on a daily basis, that there's something deficient about your practice. And I think a balanced practice that has consistent meditation and consistent daily practice and real intention um, for a householder, which we're all community practitioners, is the way that we end up having a balanced life and having uh, insights and finding satisfaction and peace. So I guess no questions. Oh, we got one. Nicholas,
Thank you very much, Dennis.
good evening.
Good evening to you. Thank you. I'm not sure how to formulate the question. What I want to ask about, you are talking tonight about two aspects of the self, or how the self can, I don't know, in my words, transform itself from the experiencing one to the empty one. And there, you also talked about wisdom. So it was tonight, I didn't understand very well the place of wisdom in this process. Would it be okay? Would you mind to reframe that, or say a few words about wisdom?
Yeah,
In
in
this,
short order, in relationship to this, wisdom is actually recognizing that we're not talking about transforming or transcending or recreating the self, because the self is nothing more than a collection of deep historical attachments to viewing things separately. So wisdom is here, the wisdom insight here is when the conditions are right, and that falls away, and you actually fall into the way that things are, that there's all of this experience taking place, that it's all dependent and it's all conditioned on each other, and it's not separate. And you see that, and then that begins to inform your life very slowly over a period of time. So does that help?
Yes, Dennis. Thank you so much. So you don't see it as something that we do, more as something that we fall into or glide into somehow, and way to see
Yes, you can't make insight happen. But what you can do is through consistent, repetitive, well-intentioned practice, you can set up the conditions that allows insight to arise. So, the mind has to be relatively collected. It has to be stable. There has to be an intention to actually explore and investigate, not just become concentrated, not just become comfortable, but to actually see deeply into experience. And so, we work on these things, and then the conditions are right, and boom, insight arises. Yeah, it can be frustrating and exciting because it has its own timetable, and it's an internal timetable.
Thank you so much, Dennis. That's wonderful.
Good question.
Hi, this is
Okay,
Jen
so
from the
I
meditation
think
hall. Do we have time for one more, Dennis?
one quick one.
Great, Marcia.
Hey, Dennis, it's Marcia.
Hey.
I'm going to stand in front
Hey.
of the camera so those online can see me as well. So I have a comment and a question. I hope it's not too long. So the comment is that when I first started practicing, I heard Jack Kornfield say one time that enlightenment, which can be, in this case, replaced with insight. If insight is an accident, then meditation makes you accident prone. And that's always stuck with me because it's so helpful in describing what you did describe.
That's
how
cute
that
too,
works. What?
It's catchy, it's cute,
Yeah, it's easy
Yeah.
to remember. And then the other question that I had is enlightenment and insight. Can those two things be exchanged in language, or are they different?
From my perspective, they are related but different. Most of the time when you hear the term enlightenment, it's referring to a stage of practice where we go through a whole series of stages of purifying the mind. And it's normally considered the end of practice, basically. It's where the experience that I was describing becomes permanent. The sense of self is actually uprooted. Insight is something that is going to be large and small, continuous and progressive over a career that deepens and matures our understanding and is part of the enlightenment process. So, does that help?
Yeah, that's cool. Thank you. Hi, Drea. It's my daughter in there. Hi. Thank you, Dennis.
Okay, thank you. All right, everybody. Well, listen, thank you so much. I hope that some of this was helpful for you. And I mean, all of us really, a lot happening right now. There's always a lot of suffering in the world, but there's a lot of suffering that we know about. I think this is the big difference. And it's easy to feel crushed by it. And so coming together like this as a group of well-intentioned people, the momentum and merit that we develop, I think it's hard to understand how powerful it might be in influencing people around us and spreading out into the world. So I'd like to thank you for that. And let's really try to hold particularly the people in Gaza and in Eastern Europe right now who are suffering in our hearts. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Ken, so much. This is Jen Scott here in the hall.